And our second speaker is Dr. Matt McDowell, who is a lecturer in sport management and international development at the University of Edinburgh Murray House School of Education and Sport. He's a former tutor in Scottish and European history at the University of Glasgow, from where he received his PhD in Scottish history in 2010. Now, the cultural history of sport has been central to Matt's research and personal interests, and the origins of the national game as an organised sport is the subject of his 2013 monograph, A Cultural History of Association Football in Scotland, 1865 to 1902. From football to surfing might seem a leap, but Matt is now in the process of writing a monograph on the history of surfing in the north of Scotland, and is also in the early stages of researching a history of the Island Games sporting competition. Matt's other publications also examine sport in the British Empire and Commonwealth. And aside from articles in sport leisure journals, he's additionally published in the Journal of Scottish Historical Studies, Labour History, and the Journal of Imperial and Commonwealth History. And he is an incoming editor at Northern Scotland, one of our rivals. Matt's paper this afternoon is Surfing and the Reimagining of the North of Scotland, and it gives us a taster of the research for his forthcoming book. Matt.
Thanks very much, Richard, and thanks to everybody else. I'm just going to share my screen here. Okie dokie. Slideshow. Let's get that slideshow going. There we go. So, thanks very much, everybody. Thanks again, Richard. Thanks to thanks for the invitation. I see some well-kept names and faces in the list right there. So good to speak with you all, even if not in real life. James Miller in 1994's The Wild and Open Sea, the story of the Pentland Firth. Hold on one second. There we go. 1994, The Wild Open Sea, the story of the Pentland Firth, described the sea thus: like life itself, the sea brings good and bad fortune, and like life, it cannot be escaped, but has to be endured to made the best of. Needless to say, this is not the image that surfers had of the sea, and some popular cultural treatments of the Pentland Firth accordingly viewed it as a place of freedom and liberation at the end of a long and enlightening journey, most notably Stephen Greenhorn's 1998 play, Passing Places. Of course, Greenhorn's play, focusing on two runaway men from Motherwell, is not really about surfing, but it does encapsulate an acknowledgement of the north coast of Scotland as being a place where people surf, and a place where people bring their own preconceptions to the land and seascape. The north of Scotland for the past 50 years has indeed been viewed as the premier region in Scotland for waves. In particular, the waves of Thurso East have been the site of world-class surfing events, including the 1981 and 1993 European Surfing Championships, and a yearly competition run by kit manufacturers O'Neill from 2006 to 2011, the Highland Open, which featured the second competitive tier of men's surfing. And that, of course, does not include the many others who have traveled up to the north coast and the east coast of Cape Ness, looking for waves. The title of my paper implies, of course, that the north of Scotland has somehow been reimagined and reinvented through surfing. And to some extent it has, but that reimagining is part of a much longer dialogue, and in many cases monologue, about the north of Scotland's place in the world. Surfing in the north of Scotland is discussed very little in previous scholarly historiography, the one exception being Joan Ormrod in her PhD research on the rhetoric and media of early British surf culture. And even in Ormrod's otherwise excellent work, there is a tendency to look at Britain rather than Scotland. It is certainly, however, based within a small historiography of sport in the north of Scotland, not just people like Hugh Dan McLennan and Grant Jarvie, who have quite a lot of contributions regarding the meaning of Highland sport, but also more recent work by Annie Tinley and Heather Haynes on the management of the River Helmsdale and Strathully in the context of the great social upheaval during and after the Sutherland clearances. Gordon Cameron on the Billach na Ba on the Applecross Peninsula as an historic challenge environment, and Paul Gilchrist's article on the 1967 televised climb on the Old Man of Hoy in Orkney. Another work which has surprisingly not been used much, such as Ian Levitt's 2005 Scottish Affairs article on the controversial UK government investment in the development of Aviemore, which, while not being in Caithness and Sutherland, has a lot to teach us about central government's relationship with sport and tourism in the broader Highlands and Islands. Of course, as you've guessed by now, a lot of this deals with land and not coast or water. And sometimes I wonder if I'm advancing that trend here. And I'm very mindful of the fact that I'm not speaking about Caithness and Sutherland necessarily as the center of the universe. I'm speaking about it as the end of the road. So that changes the tenor of it as well. This research forms part of an ongoing book project on surfing's history and present in the north of Scotland, and more specifically in Caithness and Sutherland. Like everything else, it's been somewhat disrupted by the pandemic. And obviously that's teaching this year for me has been a very labor-intensive thing. But to date, this research is in part based on archival research performed in Wick, Inverness, Edinburgh, London, and Newquay. And I've also seen some of the limited distribution periodicals and documents of the Scottish Surfing Federation, the SSF for short. It's also based on online media research, as well as to date, 20 interviews with 17 people, quite a few of whom are surfers, but also policymakers, hospitality owners, and others. My research has examined many facets, including the existence of a surfing community as such in the north of Scotland, geography and environment, surfing's connection to tourism more broadly, the north of Scotland's place within broader development of sport, and how surfing reflects the complexities of Caithness and Sutherland identity in a changing Scotland. And certainly today I'm going to miss out on a lot of stuff. And I'm very, very happy to take questions afterwards or emails, whatever. I hope it's not too contemporary. And during questions, I'm more than happy to discuss how surfing first got into England, Wales, and Ireland. It's several long stories, not just one. But for the most part, surfing first arrived in Scotland through slightly different routes. And whilst many English and Welsh surfers came to the north of Scotland, there's very little overlap with British surfing institutions, most notably the British Surfing Association, the BSA. In all cases, however, surfing's popularity in the UK had less to do with post-war interaction with the United States and more with interactions, professional and otherwise, with the former British Empire and Commonwealth. And it is interesting that of all countries, quite a few of Scotland's early surfers had either learned to surf in New Zealand, traveled to New Zealand after learning to surf, or in the case of one person, Dounreay Nuclear Power Facility employee Bob Treeby, a New Zealander themselves. It is Treeby who is generally believed to be the first person to surf in the north coast of Scotland. And Dounreay formed the nucleus of the original group of north of Scotland surfers. As Linda Ross has recently noted in her PhD research, the Dounreay Sports and Social Club was established in 1958, which largely catered to its employees, not just to build an esprit de corps, but also a reflection of a workforce who lived apart both socially and with the construction of the Pennyland housing estate quite often, but not always, geographically apart, and often bound together through official secrets legislation. Murray Watson noted the trebling of Thursday's population from 1951 through 1971, largely due to the opening of Dounreay and the need to attract workers from elsewhere, leading to a large English in-migration. He noted that there was a similar flow seen due to the construction of the Sullom Voe terminal in Shetland. And in her 2009 PhD thesis, Kimberly Masson even stated her conclusion that there were three distinct categories of Caithness residents: Caithnesians, atomics, the incomers associated with Dounreay and their families, and white settlers, obviously the last one not a very nice term. And that in the social sphere, there was very little overlap between these three groups. The Caithness Sutherland surfing scene, however, offers some evidence to the contrary, at least under the guise of a unique activity. Perhaps more than anybody, it is an engineer at Dounreay, Pat Kieran, who originally arrived in 1976 from Edinburgh, Merseyside, who is typically credited for cultivating the North Coast surfing scene, and whilst being qualified to work at Dounreay and after his employment there becoming a STEM educator, he moved to the north of Scotland for the waves. And for several years in the late 1970s and early 1980s, Kieran did not live at the Pennington estate. He lived at Thurso East, near Thurso Castle, in houses owned by the second Viscount Thurso, in perfect view of Thurso East's waves. The region's sporting culture was certainly noted as changing due to the incomers. Author and poet George Gunn, in 2015's The Province of the Cat, A Journey to the Radical Heart of the Far North, remembered growing up during the early years of atomic arrivals and heading to the new Thurso High School for the first time, and part of the disorienting experience not just being the wide array of non-Caithness accents, but the presence of rugby, which in his words was part of a foreign culture which emphasized different measures of human achievement and worth. The irony, of course, that one of the other major surf scenes formed out with Dounreay was at Thurso High School and was dominated by teenage girls, and one of them remains the major local surfing coach to this day, based as she is within the North Shore Surf Club, which she started in the high school. In this Zoom call, I am probably not saying anything shocking, especially for those based up there, by noting that if one arrives in Thurso knowing nothing about the town, no one who drives on Trail Street or walks down the pedestrian shopping center of Rotterdam Street you'd see very little that tells you that this is a site of world-class surfing. It is not Newquay. There are no shops, and shops which have appeared struggle for custom. One was able to turn itself successfully into a surf-themed cafe, but display tokens from local history of surfing, but it too closed down in 2019. It is perhaps ironic then, as we'll discuss, that the north of Scotland's surfing scene has for so long been seen amongst people resident on the North Coast in the context of public relations, but also with the coming closing of Dounreay, regeneration. Thurso is not, say, Brighton or many other places out with Britain, whose surfing scenes were heavily associated with moral panics around delinquency. And the resident surfing community is certainly not visible as being something other, or even that big. A 2013 census by the Scottish Surfing Federation identified 1,533 regular surfers in Scotland, regular meaning people who surfed a minimum of 4 times a year and owned their own kit. Only 52 regular surfers lived in Caithness and Sutherland, not an overwhelming amount compared with the other major sites of Scottish surfing. It's a very different sporting geography from football. Other major sites of sporting surfing, including Fraserburgh, where 45 lived, Tiree, 20, the Hebrides out with Tiree, 17, and the coast between Edinburgh and Eyemouth, 770. And indeed, Edinburgh University alone had 58 surfers, and one of the earliest surfing cultures in Scotland was based around what is now Napier University. And I've met quite a few Edinburgh Uni students who travel up. Going back to Miller's earlier quote, this one posted up here, written for a 1980s issue of the Cornwall-based Surf magazine by a Thurso teenager, hints at a very different relationship with the sea, needless to say. John Anderson, amongst others, would probably say that I can't write about surfing because I've never surfed. And indeed, those who have surfed in the north of Scotland write about the sensory experience of it far differently than perhaps I would. I'll let you read it for a sec. But there was more than simply sense happening here. That same column from the teenage boy, just as Pat Kieran had done about a decade earlier when he sent a letter back down to England requesting that friends come up and join him. It mapped out the area's smaller surfing breaks as well, including Melvick, Strathy, Torresdale Bay, Dunnet Beach, and Kais, all names that would appear on your own maps of the north of Scotland. But there are other names that don't appear, most notably the beach in Thurso itself, which is known by local surfers as Shitpipe. I made the mistake once of going into local shops and asking where shit pipe was. I didn't see any signs for it, so I thought it was okay to ask. It has smaller waves than Thurso East, and for the past 30 years has largely trained younger surfers. As it hints at, shit pipe refers to the now mostly unused pipe which transported the town's raw sewage into the Pentland Firth and River Thurso. The 2006 hosting of the World Qualifying Series coincided with the opening of a £13 million treatment project from Scottish Water, which ended the dumpling, but the name shit pipe still sticks. This is very much the heart of the contradiction regarding surfing in the north of Scotland. An idyllic landscape and seascape, a chance to be at one with nature in an historic landscape without necessarily specifying what history, and that's very important. But sitting on a very busy waterway in the Pentland Firth, one which was always a small mistake away from an ecological catastrophe. And back on land, that's before we get to the legacy, excuse me, of the clearances and its environmental legacy. Jess Ponting, in the context of the Pacific Islands, has referred to the phenomenon of Nirvanification among surfers, the tendency to want to make a place paradise, both in one's head and in the way surfers control the local economy, i.e. by excluding local agency and decision-making. And in the Highlands and Islands, albeit with very different racial dynamics, we know this phenomenon very well in other contexts. We've certainly read about it in the works which have nothing to do with surfing by James Hunter, John Glendinning, Catherine Haldane Grenier, Christina Fenyo, and others regarding the tendency to romanticize the post-Culloden Highlands and Islands towards commercial ends, including adventure, and how this was reflective of an increasing power imbalance and geographic distance between those who own the land and those who lived on it. And within lifestyle sports, there's an extra component of that, surfing in particular. Belinda Wheaton has noted that most media and periodicals produced by the industry is reflective of white male achievement and the social and geographical mobility that can really only be possible if you're middle class to start with. Once again, then, most, but not all magazine accounts and many a YouTube film of surfing in the north of Scotland have been tourist accounts of the regions produced by outsiders, and usually for outsiders, with their own preconceptions of what Scotland is supposed to be like, sometimes used towards explicitly commercial ends. In many of these YouTube video clips and magazine accounts, the very first frames, the starting point, is usually the journey up the A9. The main event manager of the O'Neill Highland Open during last decade, for instance, I interviewed him earlier this year. He was a marketing mad, and he was quite explicit about the fact that Thurso East, Grim's Ness, and other locales on the North Coast made a very attractive backdrop, particularly through digital streaming, through which to sell wetsuits, which are required in the cold temperature of the North Coast water. And again, that extra layer of inequality on top of that, men's wetsuits have more advanced technology than women's wetsuits, a byproduct of who within the industry is driving technological change. But because of the presence and cleanup of Dune Ray, still the biggest employer in the region, particularly if one accounts for all of the businesses which rely on Dune Ray, there are still enough critical accounts of that supposed nirvana. One of the most attractive local beaches to surfers, in particular left-footed surfers, goofy footers as they're called in surfing, Sandside Bay, is immediately adjacent to Dune Ray, and in 1995, Sandside was closed. Details in a government report released that year on the large numbers of cases of leukemia in and around Thurso found evidence of a 1977 explosion near the Dune Ray site in a coastal pit which had been created to store nuclear waste, and that this explosion had sent radioactive particles onto Sandside, and this revelation was the first of a catalog of incidents which would eventually lead to the phased closure of Dune Ray. Even afterwards, this became a means of achievement for some surfers here, including Eugene Telemach from the south of England originally, but here's seen about to surf sandside in the 2004 surf movie Cold Rush, set in the north of Scotland and directed by Mark Lumsden, who sadly passed away while surfing off the coast of the Isle of Lewis in 2019. As you can see from these quotes from The Surfer's Path, always one of the more critical surfing periodicals, traveling surfers themselves were obviously unsettled by the continuous trickle of bad news about Dune Ray, but accordingly it did not stop them from surfing there. Many locals' own thoughts on Dune Ray were, of course, a bit more nuanced than kind of external opinions of it, and I'll let you have a wee read of these couple quotes here. And as with reinvention in lifestyle sport, this resembled a reinvention of the highlands and islands that other adventurers before them took part in, and not an unproblematic one. So how have officials in Caithness viewed surfing? It's certainly not quite a new spaceport, which for those in Scotland know that has received planning permission to build a new spaceport in Sutherland. Much needed economic value, but there's a whole kind of military industrial complex thing going on there as well too, which is causing worry. And as tourism goes, surfing interlinks, but is not wholly connected to the tourism associated with the North Coast 500. And North Coast 500 is a whole nother topic, and I'm more than happy to talk about its relationship to that too. But surfing has long been viewed as playing a role regarding public relations, probably because it is viewed as an aspirational, attractive, and upwardly mobile activity. In keeping with surfers' reputations for being frugal, and therefore being difficult tourists to cater for and make money off of, local tourism officials and those in charge of efforts to regenerate the economy in the post-Dune Ray era do not view surfers as a moneymaker in and of themselves. And that's also hard because of the waves. On the north coast of Scotland, you need a low pressure system over Iceland to make them. So that's usually in the winter with colder weather and less sun. You're not exactly talking about California here, but we've seen in places like in Norway that's many cases the attraction, the trope of being able to survive it, the gendering of the place. Also, the conservative tourist culture of the Highlands and Islands during the past 50 years has catered to the likes of golf, hunting, and perhaps more appropriate to this topic, angling, and vis-a-vis the bombardment of more recognizable signifiers of Highlandness, as it's commonly understood out with Scotland. Surfing does not get much of a look within these. And besides, surfers tend to either sleep in their vans or camp out. Again, not a group of tourists that the tourist industry at present in the Highlands does a particularly good job of catering to. But the old Caithness District Council in the 1980s published a pamphlet for traveling surfers which featured maps of the major and minor breaks and tips for riding them. The Caithness Courier in 1991 believed surfing to be, quote, one of our biggest public relations assets, and we ought to be doing all that we can to encourage both it and our surfing visitors. The investment in this was believed to be a modest one, a potential clubhouse. After years of debate, that clubhouse was only opened last year in 2019 through funding from the Rotary Club rather than through Highland Council. Trust me, I looked at a lot of Highland Council minutes for this elusive discussion of a surfing clubhouse that never actually happened. My dog's trying to get in the room. Oh well, he's not going to be able to manage. Anyway, there is a new tourism body in the past few years which has been created in Caithness and Sutherland called Venture North that has been working largely out with the auspices of Visit Scotland, and it's included surfing in its promotional films of the area. And to local regeneration officials, this has been very attractive, not just for tourism purposes, but for the much broader lifestyle it potentially sells. I've placed this quote from an official involved in regeneration from an interview in 2017. Pause a sec. And indeed, this same official was similarly happy about a recent documentary which had aired on CBBC's My Life. For those who don't, not in the UK, CBBC is the BBC's kids network. And kids television, as ever, is quite often better than adults BBC. But the CBBC program My Life, which documented a Thurso girl's journey to prepare for the youth surfing championships in the Azores, believing that this was additionally a progressive element in the narrative for the region and surfing in the region. And at least to some extent, this official was kind of hinting that it alters the gendering of the region and gives it a much needed, more progressive sheen on it, a story that they want to tell. And it's very much that context that surfing exists within. This is a work in progress with a lot of half-written chapters. So my thoughts are probably a bit all over the place. Some of my research on other topics looks at, as Richard said in the intro, looks at Scotland's historic sporting relationships with Scandinavia and indeed the Atlantic Rim's sporting relationships with each other, not just the British Empire and Commonwealth. And in the post-Brexit UK world, and Scotland, and as Scotland begins to lean very heavily into this idea of independence, maybe more so than it did in 2014, the historiography of Scottish sport needs to make more of an effort to discuss Scotland's relationship with the sea. I think you all do it a lot better than we do. Moreover, however, work such as this attempts to interrogate the way that the north of Scotland is changing and the way that change is managed, marketed, and reflects broader currents of change. But nevertheless, while surfing might seem like an incongruous lens through which to view this change in a cold, windy north of Scotland, it is arguably effective at capturing different kinds of change beneath the surface of the broader discourses about the region and its coasts, along with more nuanced attitudes towards the sea than quite a lot of talk in Scotland typically allows. I said this is an abridged version, and I look very forward to your questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you very, very much there, Matt. I love that. Last year, you said that it's possibly a bit too up to date for us. Last year, we had a paper on coastal rowing in Easter Ross, contemporary. So no, we are very much an up to the minute society. Covered a hell of a lot of ground there. A lot of very interesting topics, ranging from macroeconomics, politics, down to the social and cultural dimensions of surfing as a community, as much as it is a sport. I was interested in the comment you made towards the beginning, though, around about the presentation of the surfing locales on the North Coast as being end of the road rather than centre of the universe. And just wondering, why has that perhaps not played as much as it might have done into the growth and interest? Because that's part of the challenge, is it not, to a lot of surfers, that you go to these really, really difficult to get to places, and it becomes a badge of honour.
Yeah, I think it's attractive to them, and it's probably when you think basically that you think that about where surfing is big, for instance, in the UK, Newquay, has the tourist infrastructure and everything like that, but the public transport to Cornwall is pretty poor. Maybe it might even be better going to Thurso than it is to Newquay, and other locales and everything like that. If you're looking at Wales, for instance, the big scene in Wales is very well covered. It's in Port Talbot, Aberavon, in this very, very, very industrial area with dirty water and the such. So these are all very easy places to get to. And obviously, at the end of the day, being the end of the road for Thurso is quite attractive. But I think in terms of, I'm mindful of we're talking about Scotland as being the kind of the center of this Nordic empire and everything like that, which probably a lot of the speakers here are very familiar with that version of it. And I think interesting that being in the United Kingdom in 2020 and very much that geography is altered. It's very, and as I said, it's a very different geography from say football, where football is based in cities. It's all about relationship to urban work and the such. And it's trying to get your head around it and try to actually get a driver's license to be able to drive to these places is kind of one of the challenges of it, I think.
Okay. It's just, you know, I mean, I live in Perth. I go up and down the A9 on a big basis. And the one thing I can remember not having plenty of windsurfing boards, but not surfing boards on top of beat up old camper vans. But it's just, yeah, it's something that has been striking. Any other questions? No? I don't think there's any.
We do have a question. Colleen Beatty is just noting re poor transport links, Thurso and Newquay, that they are okay to get to, and that Newquay has a long history of surfing, obviously, but Thurso is really cold, unlike Newquay, and surely climate is an important component.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree, and I think that's the attraction, yeah, for a certain kind of surfer. And definitely, you would not go to Thurso looking for the Hawaii experience or even the Newquay experience or the Devon experience or anything like that, basically. But obviously, if you're talking about Newquay, you can also go to Newquay in the summertime and enjoy it as a tourist place in general. Now, I like going up to the north of Scotland in the summertime. I avoided it like the plague this year, but you know, given the lockdown restrictions and everything like that. But I like going up there in the summertime. And there's been quite a lot of debate throughout the years in Caithness as to how to make it more of a site of tourism that attracts, you know, big American coach tours and everything like that, and you know, raise the quote unquote, raise the standard of restaurant. But one of the things that you have going on in Thurso too is that the tourist economy in Thurso itself caters quite a bit to Dune Ray workers. So it's having to kind of pivot and make that shift in terms of it to make it more of an attractive place. There was also talk in around 1990 and appearing in the Caithness Courier and the such about trying to rebrand Caithness as this place where unemployed tourists could go. And they brought this up and they're being tapped on the shoulder saying, hey, you know, you realize that the houses up here are very, very expensive, right? And how are we gonna get cheap rents for unemployed people? I don't know. So there's been all sorts of sort of schemes and everything like that to try to make, you know, build up tourism in the area. And it's unlikely that surfing tourism builds it up to the point where it makes a lot of money off it. It's how it changes the narrative in terms of it and how it gets people talking about a place. That's the important bit.
Thank you. Just an observation here, Matt, from Barbara Crawford, saying Brim's Ness, which you mentioned in your paper, it derives from the Old Norse word for surf. Did you know that?
I think I've heard it once, but now I know it for good.
Absolutely, definitely.
It's probably interesting even to note too that in terms of the history of these places and all that, most surfers note the Nordic period. They note Thor's River, Thurso, and everything like that, and then it's straight to Dune Ray. Now, some surfers do try to learn about the clearances and everything like that, but it's usually that jump that goes right across it, and usually the national signifiers tend to be the usual ones in Scotland: tartan, haggis, whiskey, etc., so on and so forth. There's no talk about controversies over Gaelic on road signs. That's not even understood.
Right. Now, a final question then for you come in from Ryan F. Has there been any attempt to encourage surfing in Shetland or Orkney as a Hawaii of the Northern Hemisphere? I'm thinking in relation to the tourism project that Colleen was involved in. The Hawaii of the North. I like it.
I would be curious to know that. I know that there are surfers on Orkney. and obviously Caithness compares itself to Orkney as a matter of stricture, basically. And but obviously it's that thing about surfers, do they want to be discovered, how much they want to do it, and everything like that. I think Caithness ones have a bit less of a problem with that, but it could be a bit different with Orkney. There is a big community I know there's a decent sized community of surfers on Lewis as well. Shetland I didn't know about. I think I've heard that there are surfers on Shetland, but I do know Orkney and I do know Lewis in terms of being these kind of places that have been written about in the UK surf press before, but don't quite seem to get the kudos of Thurso, Brimsness, Dunnet, etc.
Okay. Well, thank you once again, Matt. There's
My pleasure.
Quite a few questions. It looks like the definite interest in your continuing study. So thank you very much for all of us, and a round of applause virtually from all the 100 participants in the conference this afternoon. Thank you.